It was a warm August weekend in 2018, and I had taken my 9-year-old nephew, Liam, to South Mountain State Park in Maryland. It wasn't too far from home, but far enough that we felt like we were getting away from everything. Liam loved camping, and I figured a couple of days outdoors would be a nice break for both of us. We had picked a spot in a popular section of the park, near a lake where families swam and kayaked. The place was packed with other campers, so it didn't feel isolated. More like a temporary neighborhood made of tents and RVs. We spent most of the afternoon swimming in the lake. The water was warm, and Liam had a blast splashing around. The park had this family-friendly vibe, with people grilling nearby, kids playing on the sandy shore, and the faint smell of sunscreen in the air. By the time we decided to head back to our site, the sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting everything in golden light. Our campsite was nestled between a small wooded area and the gravel loop where cars passed. Directly across from us, there was a solo camper, a man in his late 60s or so. I had noticed him briefly the day before when we set up our tent. He had a simple setup: a small blue tent, a folding chair, and a stack of firewood neatly piled by the fire pit. He didn't interact much with anyone, just quietly sat in his chair reading a book. As Liam and I walked back, dripping wet and wrapped in towels, the first thing I noticed was the cluster of park ranger trucks and a police car near our site. My stomach dropped. The flashing lights felt out of place in such a peaceful setting. A few other campers were standing around, murmuring quietly to each other, craning their necks to see what was going on. When we got closer, a ranger approached us. He had a firm but calm expression, and he stepped in front of us as if to block Liam's view of something. He explained there had been an incident at the campsite directly across from ours. The man who had been staying there had passed away in his tent. I froze for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Liam, of course, didn't fully grasp the gravity of it. He tried to peer around the ranger, but I quickly guided him back toward our tent. My mind raced. The idea of someone dying so close to where we had been relaxing, eating s'mores, and playing cards the night before was unsettling. The rangers and officers were careful as they worked. I tried not to look too much, but it was hard not to notice the black body bag being carried out of the tent. It hit me then, this wasn't just a sad story or something you hear about from a distance. It had happened right there, a few feet from where we had been sleeping. That night, Liam kept asking questions. He wanted to know what happened to the man, why he died, and what would happen next. I did my best to answer without scaring him, though I didn't have all the answers myself. It sounded like the man had passed away in his sleep, possibly from a heart attack or some other natural cause. The rangers mentioned he hadn't checked out that morning, which is why they went to check on him. As the evening went on, most of the other campers carried on like nothing had happened. Fires were lit, and the smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I glanced across the gravel road, I saw his empty campsite, the firewood still stacked neatly by the pit, the tent now packed up and gone. Liam, being a kid, had a way of lightening the mood, though not always in the most appropriate way. At one point, he looked at the stack of firewood across the road and asked if we could have it since he didn't need it anymore. I knew he wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He just didn't fully understand the weight of the situation. Still, the comment sent a chill down my spine. That night, as we sat by our own fire, I kept replaying the day in my head. I thought about the man camping alone, reading quietly in his chair, enjoying what was probably supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I wondered if he had any family, if someone would miss him, and if this was the way he would have wanted to go. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound in the woods seemed louder. Every shadow cast by the firelight felt darker. Liam slept soundly beside me, blissfully unaware of my unease. The next morning, the campsite across from us was completely cleared out, as if nothing had happened. The firewood was gone, probably taken by the rangers or another camper. But the empty space felt heavier than before. We packed up later that day and headed home. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror at the spot where the man's tent had been. It looked so ordinary, just a patch of gravel and dirt like any other site in the park. But I knew I'd never forget it. It wasn't the kind of story you tell at campfires to spook people. It was just real, uncomfortably real. And it reminded me how fragile life can be, even in the most peaceful of places. I was in my late 20s, back in 2014, when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the remote backcountry of New Mexico. I'd grown up loving the outdoors and had always found peace in solitude, surrounded by nothing but the quiet expanse of nature. This trip wasn't meant to be anything unusual, just a simple overnight stay at a secluded site off an unpaved road. It was a last-minute decision, sparked by a desire to escape the noise of my everyday life for a little while. I drove my old truck out to a spot I'd found on a map, about 50 miles from the nearest town. It was a long stretch of gravel road, with no signs of civilization for miles. I passed only a handful of other vehicles during the drive, and by the time I arrived at my chosen site, the sun was beginning to set. The area was wide open, surrounded by scrubby desert plants and distant hills. There wasn't another soul in sight, which was exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck on a flat patch of ground, set up my tent about 40 feet away, and built a small fire to cook my dinner. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of the wind and the distant chirping of insects. I felt at ease as I sat by the fire, eating and watching the stars slowly emerge in the darkening sky. By the time I crawled into my tent and zipped up my sleeping bag, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. It was pitch black outside, the kind of darkness you only find far away from city lights. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the day settle over me, and soon drifted into a light, restless sleep. Somewhere in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a sound, the crunch of gravel. My brain struggled to process it at first, my senses dulled by sleep. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of tires on the gravel road not far from my tent. My heart started pounding. Who else would be out here at this hour? I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear over the pounding of my pulse. The sound grew louder, then faded as the vehicle moved past my campsite. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably just someone passing through, I told myself. Maybe another camper or a rancher heading home late. I waited, listening as the sound of the car faded into the distance. But then, a few minutes later, the sound came back, tires crunching on gravel. The vehicle had turned around and was coming back toward my site. My chest tightened. This wasn't normal. I sat frozen, my ears tuned to the approaching noise. The car slowed down as it neared my campsite. Through the thin fabric of my tent, I could see the glow of headlights sweeping across the ground. My heart raced as the vehicle pulled off the road, coming to a stop about 40 feet from my tent, its headlights aimed directly at me. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The engine idled, a low rumble that seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and entirely out of control. Whoever was in that car could see me, but I couldn't see them. The bright lights made it impossible to make out anything beyond their glare. Minutes passed, each one stretching endlessly. I sat there, paralyzed with fear, wondering what the driver was doing. Were they watching me? Planning something? My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I thought about the knife I'd packed in my gear, but it was in the truck, not the tent. The realization made my stomach churn. After what felt like an eternity, the car suddenly revved its engine. The tires spun on the gravel, kicking up dust as the vehicle peeled away, heading back down the road. The sound faded into the distance until it was completely gone. But the fear remained, settling deep in my gut. I didn't move for a long time, listening for any sign that the car might return. Eventually, I convinced myself that whoever it was had left for good. Even so, I couldn't shake the unease. Sleep was out of the question, so I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in my tent, my ears straining for every little sound. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I was exhausted and jittery. I packed up my campsite in record time, not even bothering to make coffee or eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The drive back to town felt endless, and I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the car from the night before tailing me. I reached a small diner a couple of hours later and stopped for a much-needed cup of coffee. Sitting there, surrounded by other people, I finally felt a little safer. But the encounter had left me shaken, and I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. Who were they? What did they want? Why had they just sat there watching me in the middle of the night? That night, I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of a nearby town. The bed was uncomfortable, and the walls were paper thin, but I didn't care. At least I wasn't alone in the middle of nowhere. I drifted off to sleep, hoping to leave the unsettling experience behind me. But in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't the sound of a car that startled me. It was a noise I couldn't immediately identify, a loud, distorted scream that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. It sounded unnatural, almost electronic, like it was coming through a speaker or a walkie-talkie. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I sat up in the darkened room, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sound came again, longer and louder this time. It was impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. My stomach churned as the noise reverberated through the night, sending a chill down my spine. I thought about the car from the previous night, the way its driver had just sat there, watching me. Was it connected? Was I being followed? The sound eventually stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked out of the motel and drove straight home, cutting my trip short. I haven't been camping alone since. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened during that trip. All I know is that it left a mark on me, a deep, lingering unease that refuses to fade. It was the first time I'd ever gone camping alone as an adult, and I was excited. I'd been talking about it for months with my boyfriend, Ryan, my brother, Mark, and his wife, Lily. We'd all been close growing up, and after years of not really spending much time together, we decided to take a trip into the woods. The plan was simple: pack up the cars, find a spot in a national forest, set up camp, make some food, and just hang out by the fire. Nothing complicated, just a chance to get away and reconnect. The drive out was peaceful. We left early in the morning, the kind of drive where the sun's just rising, casting that warm, orange light over everything. It wasn't too far from where we lived, about 2 hours, but the forest felt so remote, so far from anything familiar. It was the kind of place where cell phone signals didn't reach, where the trees swallowed up the road as soon as you turned off the highway. We made it to the campsite by noon. It was a well-known area, not too crowded, with a small river running nearby and enough space for a few tents. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold, just the right kind of weather for being outside all day. Setting up camp took a little while, but we worked together, chatting and laughing as we unpacked the cars and pitched our tents. Lily and Mark's Jeep was parked near a little clearing by the river, and Ryan and I set up our tent a little further up the hill. The area was beautiful, surrounded by towering pines and the sounds of birds chirping overhead. It felt like a peaceful escape from the usual stress of life. Once the tents were up, we gathered firewood and started a fire. The crackling of the flames mixed with the rustling of the trees around us. We sat around the fire, sipping beers and sharing stories. The sky started to darken, and soon, the only light we had was from the fire. We'd been hearing the sounds of animals throughout the evening. Small critters rustling in the brush, the occasional owl hooting in the distance. It was all part of the experience, and we didn't think much of it. "I'm sure there are raccoons in these woods," Mark said, poking at the fire with a stick. "We've heard a few during the day, but I'm sure they'll be more active at night." "I wouldn't worry about it," Ryan said, tossing another log on the fire. "They're probably harmless. I've had a raccoon get into my trash before," Mark replied, rolling his eyes. "They're sneaky little things." That's when we first noticed the raccoon sounds. Scratching noises, little thumps, maybe some faint growls. It wasn't anything alarming, just part of being out in the wild. The fire crackled louder, and the raccoon noises became a little more distinct as the night went on. Mark was right. Raccoons were likely out there, but they stayed out of sight. We locked up our food and other stuff in the cars just to be safe, making sure we didn't leave anything outside that could attract them. When it was finally time to go to bed, we packed up the cooler and locked everything in our cars. Ryan and I double-checked our tent before we crawled inside. Mark and Lily, a few yards away, got into their own tent, and we settled in for the night. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the drive and setting up camp. But I woke up in the middle of the night to an odd noise. A soft, rhythmic thumping, almost like something was hitting the side of the tent. My first thought was that it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But when the thumping continued, it felt different, like something was banging against metal. I lay there still, trying to figure out what it was. The noise didn't stop, and now it sounded like it was coming from the direction of Mark and Lily's Jeep. I didn't think much of it at the time. Animals roam around campsites at night, and we were well off the trail, so there was no reason to panic. I figured it would stop soon, but it didn't. Then I heard a faint scream. It was Mark. I could hear him shouting in the distance, his voice frantic. "Mark," I whispered, sitting up in my tent. Ryan stirred next to me, groggily asking what was going on. "Did you hear that?" I asked, already starting to get out of the tent. Ryan nodded, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, sounds like Mark." I grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent. The cold night air hit me as I stepped out into the dark campsite. The fire had died down to embers, casting little light around the area. I shined the flashlight towards Mark and Lily's tent and saw Mark running towards their Jeep, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. "There's something in the Jeep," Mark yelled. "I can't get it out." I ran over, Ryan following behind. The Jeep's trunk was wide open, and the rear hatch door was swinging loosely. I saw a few pieces of food on the ground, strewn across the dirt. At first, I thought it was some wild animal, maybe a bear or something bigger. But then I saw the smaller figures. Raccoons. There were 3 of them inside the back of the Jeep, rummaging through the bags of snacks and cans we'd left behind. They were acting like little thieves, pulling things out and tossing them aside, looking for anything else they could rip open. They weren't being aggressive, but the sight was pretty unsettling. They had the whole back area of the Jeep trashed. Mark was standing there frozen, his hands on his head. I didn't lock the Jeep. I thought I did, but I guess I didn't. "Well, there's not much to do now," I said, trying to stay calm. "We'll just have to wait for them to leave." Ryan walked around to the other side of the Jeep, shining his flashlight into the back. "They're not hurting anything, just a mess. I think they're just after food." Mark sighed in relief. "Thank God. I thought they were tearing everything apart." The raccoons didn't seem bothered by us at all. They were so focused on the trash, they didn't even notice we were standing there. We decided to wait a bit longer to see if they would leave, but after a few minutes, they slowly started to back out of the Jeep one by one. They hopped down, their little bodies scurrying away into the darkness, disappearing into the brush. The Jeep was a mess, but nothing was seriously damaged. I closed the trunk, and Mark locked it up this time, making sure everything was secure. We stood there for a moment, taking in the bizarre scene. The whole thing had been so unexpected, so random, but we all knew it could have been worse. Guess we're lucky they just wanted snacks and not something more valuable, Ryan said. Mark nodded, breathing a little easier. Yeah, I'll definitely make sure everything's locked from now on. The rest of the night went without incident. We made sure to clean up any leftovers and put everything safely in the cars. It wasn't exactly the peaceful camping experience I'd imagined, but it was memorable, and it was definitely a story to tell. When morning came, we all gathered around the now-cold fire, sipping coffee and eating breakfast. The sun was rising, casting golden light through the trees, and the campsite felt quieter. The animals had gone, and the world around us felt still again. There was a slight chill in the air, but it was a good kind of chill, the kind that only happens in the early hours of the day. Mark and Lily were cleaning out the Jeep, checking to make sure nothing was ruined. There was some trash in the back, but it wasn't as bad as it had seemed in the moment. A few snack wrappers, some plastic bags, but nothing serious. Well, that's one way to start a morning, Mark joked. I laughed, but I was still a little shaken. The whole thing had felt too surreal, like something you read about in a book or see in a movie. It reminded me how unpredictable nature could be. It was beautiful and peaceful, but also wild and untamed. We packed up our tents and gear and made our way back to the cars, ready to head home. Despite the chaos of the night, the trip had been worth it. I was glad to have had the experience, even if it didn't go exactly as planned. Camping in the wilderness wasn't always peaceful, and sometimes it came with surprises. But that's what made it real. The uncertainty, the unexpected. And for me, that was the part of camping that made it worth coming back to. It was my second week on the job, and the rain seemed to follow me wherever I went. Working the night shift at a small, isolated campground in the mountains wasn't exactly my dream job, but the pay was decent, and the quiet was something I needed. Most nights, the only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bat or the wind rustling through the trees. But tonight was different. The storm hit hard, the kind that makes you feel like the world is pressing down on you. The rain was so thick I could hardly see past the headlights of my truck. The road to the campground had been winding and narrow, and I was already starting to feel a bit uneasy, even before the downpour began. I pulled into the parking lot, hoping to get everything set up quickly and hunker down in my cabin for the night. The campground was just small enough to be quiet, but big enough to be a pain when it rained. We had a few campers, mostly families who were brave enough to sit out in the storm, but no one else around. The weather was unpredictable, and I didn't expect anyone new to show up. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from my truck and walked down the long gravel path toward the ranger station, my boots sloshing in the wet ground. The rain had made the usually quiet path eerily loud. Each step was drowned by the rhythmic patter of water hitting the trees. I couldn't help but feel a little unnerved by the sound. It was almost like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Once I reached the ranger station, I locked up my truck and turned the key in the heavy door. The small room was dim, lit only by a flickering fluorescent light. The sound of the storm outside was muted by the thick walls. It felt almost comforting in a way, like I was in my own little world where the chaos outside couldn't touch me. I sat at the desk, pulled out a cup of coffee, and checked the radio. The static crackled through the speakers, making it hard to hear anything. but I caught bits of the forecast: storm warning, flash flooding possible, stay safe. I muttered under my breath, pushing the radio off. I didn't need to be reminded. The night was moving slowly, and I wasn't sure whether that was a relief or just adding to my growing unease. Around midnight, when the storm was at its peak, the power went out. It wasn't a huge surprise. Storms like this often knocked out the lines, but the darkness was almost suffocating. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning. I grabbed the flashlight, clicked it on, and headed outside to check the campground. The wind howled, sending branches swaying and creaking like the trees were about to snap. I squinted through the flashlight beam, but the rain made it nearly impossible to see much. The path between the cabins was flooded in some places, water pooling in puddles that reached up to my ankles. It was the kind of rain that soaked you right through your rain gear. As I walked toward the far end of the campground, I noticed something odd. One of the cabins seemed to have its door wide open, and the dim light inside flickered, almost like someone was still inside. I was certain I'd locked everything earlier, and no one was supposed to be out here this late. Everyone had checked in earlier in the evening, and the weather was too rough for anyone to just wander out. I approached the cabin cautiously, the air growing thick with tension. The door was indeed ajar, just barely, but the light inside, that wasn't normal. The storm was supposed to drown out any light, yet there it was, flickering through the rain-soaked window. My first instinct was to check inside and make sure no one had gotten stuck or hurt in there, but a nagging feeling in the back of my mind told me I should go back to the station and call for help. The power was still out, and something about the scene didn't sit right with me. I stood there for a moment, torn between my duty and my gut feeling. But duty won out, and I pushed open the door. The hinges creaked like they hadn't been used in years, and the door slammed shut behind me as I stepped into the small cabin. The smell of damp wood and mildew hit me immediately. My flashlight beam flickered over the room, revealing an empty table, a couch, and a few scattered belongings. Everything looked untouched, but something about the way the furniture was arranged felt off. Then I saw it. A chair by the window was turned toward the glass, and the curtains were pulled back. Outside, I could see the storm raging, but there was no one there. No sign of anyone sitting in the chair, no trace of recent movement. It was almost like someone had been watching the storm, waiting for something. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I tried to shake it off. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone had left in a hurry, or the storm had scared them off. But as I stood there in the silence, the unease grew heavier, suffocating almost. I turned to leave, but then I noticed something on the floor. It was a muddy boot print, trailing from the door toward the back of the cabin. I bent down, shining my light on it. The print was fresh, maybe from only a few minutes ago. But how could that be? I had walked the path just an hour ago, and I hadn't seen anyone. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. The cabin had been empty when I first came in, but now it felt like something was wrong, like I wasn't alone anymore. The wind outside picked up, causing the cabin to shake. I glanced out the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The storm was reaching its peak. Thunder cracked like a gunshot, making me jump. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible noise. The unmistakable sound of something shifting on the floor behind me. Slowly, I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The room was still empty, but the boot print, it seemed to lead further into the cabin. I had not seen it before, but now it was unmistakable. The trail was clear, leading toward a small closet in the back corner. I swallowed hard and took a slow, deliberate step toward it. My heart raced in my chest, and the silence felt like it was closing in on me. The flashlight beam bounced erratically as I held it in front of me. I reached the closet and paused for a moment, unsure whether I was imagining things or whether I was really alone. With one hand, I grabbed the door handle. The wood was damp, cold against my skin. I yanked it open, half expecting to find someone hiding inside. But there was nothing, just a small storage area with cleaning supplies and old camping gear. Relief washed over me, but I didn't dare relax. I scanned the room again, the unease still clinging to me like a second skin. I turned to leave but froze in my tracks when I saw the window again. The chair. It was turned completely around now, facing away from the glass. I didn't know what was going on, but I wasn't staying to find out. I backed out of the cabin, slamming the door behind me. The rain hit me like a wall as I ran toward the station. My feet splashed through the water as I tried to hurry, but every time I looked over my shoulder, it felt like someone was following me. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I could almost hear footsteps in the distance. When I finally reached the ranger station, I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my body felt like it had been running for miles. I stood there for a long moment just listening. The storm raged outside, but inside, there was only silence. And then, in the quiet, I heard something else. A knock, soft at first, then louder until it was unmistakable. Someone was at the door. I didn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Something wasn't right. The storm had covered everything up, but there was no mistaking it. I was not alone. It was late December, and the winter chill had started to set in. I was 27 years old, a simple guy with a taste for adventure. I had planned a solo camping trip to a remote patch of forest near the border of Montana and Wyoming. The weather was looking harsh, with snowstorms expected over the next few days, but that only added to the challenge. I was used to roughing it, or so I thought. I parked my truck at the trailhead, the snow already inching its way up the tires. I loaded up my gear and set out. The trail was untouched, and as I walked, the silence around me was overwhelming. No wildlife, no sound of wind, just the soft crunch of my boots in the fresh snow. The sky was overcast, the clouds a heavy gray, and everything felt still, frozen in time. I hadn't planned on making it too far, just a couple of miles to an old, abandoned hunting cabin I'd read about. It was a bit of a stretch to call it a cabin, more like a shack with walls that barely kept out the wind. But it was a place to get out of the cold for the night. I knew that once I reached it, I'd have the warmth of my fire and the solitude that came with being in the wilderness alone. By the time I arrived, the sun had already set, and the sky was black. I made my way to the cabin, feeling the temperature drop with every step. The snow was deep, and it was becoming harder to make progress. My hands were numb from the cold, and my breath came out in visible clouds. When I finally saw the cabin, I let out a sigh of relief. The walls were half snowed over, but there was enough of a gap to squeeze through. Inside, it was exactly as I had expected. Old, with a dusty floor and a few broken windows. But it was a roof over my head, and that was all I needed. I set to work quickly, gathering some firewood that had been left in a pile near the cabin. After a few minutes, I had a fire roaring in the makeshift fireplace. I settled in for the night, the warmth of the fire slowly taking the edge off the cold that had begun to creep into my bones. Outside, the storm had intensified, and the wind howled through the gaps in the walls. It didn't bother me much. I had expected worse. But the deeper the night went, the more unsettling the quiet outside seemed. The wind rattled the cabin, and the snow piled up higher against the windows. I sat there, staring into the fire, my mind wandering. I was alone, and the isolation was starting to weigh on me. As much as I liked being away from people, there was something eerie about the total silence. I wasn't sure if it was the storm or the endless snow that seemed to stretch on forever, but I started to feel uneasy. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the cabin, and even that seemed too loud against the stillness outside. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I was suddenly jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart leapt in my chest. For a moment, I just sat there, frozen. The wind outside had picked up even more, and I figured it was just a branch hitting the cabin. But the sound had been too distinct, like something had hit the roof or the wall. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and made my way to the door. The storm outside was fierce, the snow blinding in the glow of my light. I scanned the area but saw nothing. The unease grew inside me. It could have been nothing, just the wind playing tricks. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like something was wrong. I stepped back into the cabin and locked the door behind me, the feeling in my gut telling me that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The storm outside seemed to intensify, and the wind began to howl louder than before. I stoked the fire, trying to push the feeling aside, but it wouldn't leave. I couldn't shake the thought that there was someone else out there. The hours dragged on, and the wind didn't let up. I stayed awake, eyes fixed on the dark window, every noise outside sending a ripple of tension through my body. The feeling that something was wrong grew stronger as the night wore on. Around midnight, the wind suddenly stopped. Everything went silent. I didn't know what to make of it. I had been so used to the storm's constant howl that the sudden stillness was almost worse. I couldn't hear the snow falling anymore, couldn't hear anything. It was as if the world had just stopped. Then, the sound came again, a soft thud, followed by a scraping noise against the side of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the crack in the wall, my mind racing. There was nothing out there, just the swirling white of the snowstorm, but that scraping noise, it was coming closer. A low, dragging sound that almost felt deliberate. My pulse quickened, and I felt a bead of sweat form on my brow despite the cold air. It didn't make sense. Who or what could be out there in this storm at this hour? I waited, my breath shallow, listening intently. The scraping continued, followed by a soft thud again. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow. Slow, deliberate, almost cautious. They were coming closer, directly toward the cabin. I backed away from the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The last thing I wanted was to confront whatever was outside. The snowstorm outside made it impossible to see anything, but the footsteps were clear, their rhythm unmistakable. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving with purpose. I felt my mind race. What should I do? There was no cell service up here, no way to call for help. I had to rely on my instincts and my knowledge of the wilderness. I grabbed my backpack and started rummaging through it, pulling out anything that might help. A knife, some extra rope, a flare gun. My breath was coming faster now, each noise outside setting my nerves on edge. The footsteps stopped right outside the cabin. I stood there, holding my breath, praying that whoever was out there would just move on. But they didn't. Suddenly, there was a loud crash as something hit the roof, and the entire cabin shook. I stumbled back, heart racing. The roof was covered in a thick layer of snow and ice, but whatever had hit it was heavy, far heavier than anything that should be up there. I bolted toward the small window in the back of the cabin and peered through the frosted glass. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, barely visible in the storm, was a figure. A person, dressed in dark clothing, hunched over and dragging something behind them. The shape was too blurry to make out clearly, but the outline was unmistakable. Whoever it was, they weren't just walking around, they were dragging something through the snow. I knew then that I wasn't just being paranoid. Something was very wrong. The figure moved away from the cabin, but I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I grabbed my things, threw on my coat, and bolted out the back door into the storm. I had no idea where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there another second. I ran through the snow, my feet sinking with every step, my breath coming in desperate gasps. I kept my head down, trying to push through the thick snow. The wind cut at my face, stinging my skin, but I didn't care. Couldn't stop. The thought of whatever was back at the cabin kept pushing me forward, fear taking over my senses. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, where I had left my truck. The storm had made the roads nearly impassable, but I didn't care. I climbed into my truck, heart racing, hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back. I never found out who or what had been out there in the storm. The footprints outside the cabin disappeared under the fresh snow by morning, and when I returned a week later, there was no sign of anyone, just the quiet of the wilderness, the untouched snow, and the eerie silence. But I knew what I heard, and I knew what I saw. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that there's something out there in those mountains, watching, waiting. I remember the summer of 2002, when I was 14 years old. My grandfather and I decided to take a camping trip to the edge of the Mojave Desert. It was a place we'd been before, but this time it felt different. Maybe it was the oppressive heat of the desert, or the way the air shimmered with the promise of something we couldn't quite see, but everything felt wrong from the moment we set up camp. Grandpa had always been a no-nonsense man. He taught me how to fish, how to make a fire without matches, and how to read the stars like a map. He'd been camping his whole life, so when he told me to pack up and head out to the desert for a weekend, I didn't hesitate. His eyes twinkled with the promise of adventure, and at that age, I didn't know the difference between what was truly dangerous and what was just exciting. We arrived at the campsite after a long drive, the landscape growing more barren with each mile. The sun was starting to set as we unloaded the truck. Grandpa set to work building a fire, his rough hands moving with practiced ease, while I sorted through our camping gear. The air was dry and the scent of sagebrush filled my nostrils. The only sound was the creaking of the truck as I unloaded it. As the sun dipped behind the jagged hills in the distance, a strange silence descended on the campsite. The usual desert sounds, the chirping of insects, the distant call of birds, seemed to fade. It felt almost as if the land itself was holding its breath. We had our dinner in the quiet, the fire crackling between us. Grandpa didn't speak much during meals, but I could feel his unease in the way he glanced around. He wasn't the type to show fear, so I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the isolation of the desert making him a bit jumpy. The night drew on, and I decided to go for a walk, hoping the cool desert air would settle my nerves. The stars above seemed closer than ever, the Milky Way cutting a swath of light across the night sky. I wandered a little too far, my feet crunching on the dry earth, my mind wandering with the shadows that stretched out before me. I noticed something strange. There was no sound, not a breeze, not a single insect. It was as if the whole desert had gone completely still. I stopped, listening, and then something caught my eye. Off in the distance, just beyond the last ridge, I saw a flicker of light, a lantern or a fire, but it was moving. I couldn't make out who or what it was, but the light was swinging, like someone carrying it. It didn't make sense. There was no road or trail out there, and no one should have been out in this part of the desert, not at this time of night. I stood frozen for a moment, watching the flickering light. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt like something wasn't right. I turned back to the campsite and hurried, not wanting to be too far from Grandpa. But when I got back, he was gone. His chair was still by the fire, but there was no sign of him. I called out his name into the night, my voice echoing strangely in the empty desert. But there was no reply. I was about to get up and search for him when I heard a sound. A low hum, coming from the direction of the ridge where I'd seen the light. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like the hum of machinery or something else, something unnatural. It made my skin crawl. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed toward the ridge, but the closer I got, the more I felt something in my gut telling me to turn around. My heart raced in my chest as I climbed higher, following the hum, my breath shallow in the thin desert air. When I reached the top, the landscape opened up before me. Below, in the valley, I saw something that froze me in place. There, in the middle of the desert, was a large metallic structure. A ship, almost, but it was not like anything I had ever seen. The light I had noticed earlier was coming from a small fire next to it, flickering weakly in the wind. I couldn't explain what I was seeing. My mind raced with confusion and terror as I tried to make sense of it, but there was no explanation. It wasn't something that belonged in the desert. It was out of place, like it had been dropped there from another world. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. My eyes were locked onto the scene below. It felt like I was being drawn in, like the hum was pulling at me, making me want to walk toward it. My hand gripped the flashlight tighter, and I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the ship. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and that's when I saw it. Grandpa's figure was silhouetted against the firelight, standing motionless next to the ship. He wasn't moving and he wasn't speaking. He just stood there, his back to me, staring at the structure. I called out to him again, my voice breaking the silence, but he didn't react. Something was wrong. Something deep inside me knew that what I was seeing wasn't my grandfather. It wasn't him. I had no proof, no clear reason, but I could feel it. This wasn't right. I turned and ran, not looking back until I reached the campsite. My hands were shaking, my chest tight with panic. Grandpa had to be close. I started shouting his name, but there was still no answer. That's when I saw it. A small note, folded and left on the edge of his chair. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. It read simply, in a handwriting I didn't recognize, "You should not have come." I didn't know what to do. The night stretched on, and the desert was still. The hum continued, faintly, in the distance. My grandfather was gone, and in his place, there was only a lingering feeling of dread that I couldn't shake. I waited, the night dragging on, until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. By then, I had convinced myself it had all been a trick of the mind, that I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't until the next morning that I found Grandpa. He was sitting by the fire, staring blankly at the ashes. His clothes were dusty, and his eyes were empty, as if he had seen something terrible. But he didn't speak, not a single word. We left the desert that day without looking back. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever had been in the desert with us that night is still out there. The hum still echoes in my mind, and I can't forget the way Grandpa looked that morning, like he wasn't really there. And to this day, I haven't been back to the desert. It was early autumn, the air just beginning to cool, when I decided to head out for a camping trip. I was 27, living in a small town in northern Idaho, and while I didn't have much of a plan, I figured a solo trip into the woods would do me good. I had spent plenty of time hiking around the area, but this was the first time I was going alone, and something about the solitude seemed appealing. I packed my gear: a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, food, a portable stove, and my trusty backpack with water, snacks, and a few other essentials. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from town, and the weather was perfect: clear skies, a light breeze. I had decided to camp near an old creek that wound through a dense stretch of forest, a place I'd hiked before, but never stayed overnight. The drive there felt peaceful enough, the highway winding past the last remnants of civilization before the forest took over. I turned off the main road, onto a dirt trail, and after a few minutes, parked my truck. I double-checked everything and started the hike. The path was narrow, overgrown in places, and the trees thickened as I went deeper. The silence in the woods was almost overwhelming, nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. The creek was exactly where I remembered it, and I found a nice spot by the water to set up my camp. The ground was soft, the trees thick around me, and everything felt like it was in its right place. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and sat down to enjoy the evening. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The temperature was dropping quickly, but the fire crackled to life, offering some warmth. As the night crept in, I sat by the fire, eating a meal of canned beans and rice. It wasn't gourmet, but it was warm and filling. I could hear the occasional rustle in the trees, but I figured it was just small animals moving about. Raccoons, squirrels, or deer. Nothing to be concerned about. After the meal, I relaxed by the fire, the flames dancing in the growing dark, and let the quiet of the woods settle over me. But as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on why. The wind had picked up, but not enough to explain the strange feeling creeping through my bones. It wasn't like the usual peace I'd felt on past trips. There was something more, something I couldn't quite place. I glanced around the camp, looking for anything that might explain it. Nothing. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the isolation getting to me. But then the noises started. At first, it was just a snap of a branch far off in the distance, maybe the wind pushing it around. Then it happened again, and again. It was closer this time, and the sound was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart skipped, but I told myself it was just an animal. A bear, maybe, or a large deer. I grabbed a flashlight and swung it around the camp. Nothing. The fire still flickered, the flames casting erratic shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. I had read stories about people hearing things in the woods at night, things that weren't there or so they thought, but this was different. The footsteps were too distinct, too human. I told myself it was nothing. I was being foolish, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I sat still by the fire, the sound of the creek rushing in the background, and waited. It was silent again for a time. The footsteps had stopped, or maybe they had just faded into the distance. I tried to relax, telling myself I was overthinking things. Then I heard it again, closer this time, too close. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just passing by. They were circling my camp. I could feel it in my gut, a cold, knotting sensation. I grabbed my knife, not really sure why, but needing something in my hand, something to steady me. My eyes darted around, searching the darkness. The footsteps stopped, and for a long while, there was nothing. The kind of nothing that presses in on you, making the quiet feel heavier. Then I heard it, a low, guttural noise just beyond the firelight. Something or someone was out there, watching. I froze, the only sound my pounding heart. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before the noise came again. This time it was closer, much closer. I could almost feel the presence, just outside the range of my vision, just beyond the reach of the light. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Every nerve in my body was on edge. Suddenly, a shape darted from the trees, too fast, too close. I barely had time to react before it disappeared back into the woods. My pulse was racing as I stood up, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I hadn't seen much, but I'd felt it. The shape, the presence. Something was out there, and it wasn't alone. I gathered my things quickly, my hands trembling as I packed away my food and gear. There was no way I was staying another minute. The last thing I needed was to find out what was watching me. I wasn't going to take that chance. As I quickly packed up my tent, I heard the noises again, more distinct this time. Rustling, shuffling feet, something brushing against branches. My breath caught in my throat as I realized. Whatever it was getting closer. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight, the fire now dying down to embers. I wasn't going to stick around to see what came next. I sprinted toward the trailhead, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I wasn't sure if something was chasing me or if it was just my own panic, but I couldn't afford to look back. The further I got from the camp, the more I heard it, those footsteps following me. Closer now. They weren't animal tracks. They were too deliberate, too human. My breath came in ragged bursts as I pushed myself harder, ignoring the fatigue that gnawed at my legs. Finally, I reached the truck. I didn't even hesitate. I threw my gear into the bed, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The truck roared to life, and I didn't look back as I sped away. I kept my eyes on the road, the trees flashing by, the headlights illuminating the darkness. When I got back to town, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't have to. The look on my face told the whole story. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still out there, waiting. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in the woods that night, but I learned something. Some places in the wilderness aren't as peaceful as they seem, and some things out there are better left undisturbed.